At 6:47 in the morning on June 6, 1944, the first boats hit Omaha Beach. Metal ramps fell down. Men ran forward into German machine gun fire. In just 12 minutes, the beach turned red with blood. But the boats kept coming, wave after wave. 31,000 men landed in the first 6 hours. None of them knew that the boats carrying them ashore had been built in a swamp 3 years earlier by workers who had never seen the ocean. This is a story of how 20,000 Louisiana workers built 23,000 landing boats and helped win the war before a single American soldier stepped onto European land. The problem started in 1940, a year before Pearl Harbor. The United States military faced a big problem that no one wanted to talk about. Every invasion plan needed one thing: a way to land thousands of soldiers directly onto enemy beaches. Traditional landing methods didn't work. Ships stopped far from shore. Men climbed down rope nets into small boats. The boats rowed to the beach. This took hours. German defenders had hours to get ready. Men died in the water before they reached land. The Navy looked at every possible choice. British landing boats were too slow. Fishing boats were too weak. Building special attack boats would take years to design. By the time engineers finished the plans, the war would be over. The invasion of Europe needed boats that didn't exist. The military needed 10,000 of them, maybe more. Nobody knew how to build them. Nobody knew who could build them. And they needed them within 2 years. If you're finding value in stories like this, stories that uncover the hidden mechanics of history, consider subscribing. We bring you the engineering breakthroughs and human decisions that change the course of wars. New documentary every week. In New Orleans, a 45-year-old boat builder named Andrew Jackson Higgins read what the military needed. He didn't apply through proper channels. He didn't wait for an invitation. He wrote directly to the Navy Bureau of Ships. His letter had one sentence: "I already built what you need." Higgins wasn't lying. For 15 years, he designed shallow boats for oil companies working in Louisiana swamps. His boats could move through water 18 inches deep. They could drive onto muddy banks, drop a ramp, unload equipment, back off the bank, and return to deep water. The oil companies loved them. The military had never heard of them. Higgins invited Navy observers to New Orleans. He showed them his boat on Lake Pontchartrain. The boat went toward the shore at full speed. The front hit the sand. The engine went backward. A steel ramp dropped from the front. Men walked off directly onto the beach. The ramp pulled back up. The boat backed into the water and left. Total time, 42 seconds. The Navy officers watched in silence. One of them asked how fast the boat could be made. Higgins looked at the lake, looked back at the officers, then said something that should have sounded crazy. "I can build 1,000 per month if you give me the contracts." The Navy didn't believe him. Higgins Industries had fewer than 300 people working there. The company ran 2 small boatyards. Its largest government contract had been for 12 patrol boats. Now, Higgins claimed he could make 1,000 landing boats every 30 days. The math didn't work. The buildings didn't exist. But the military had no other choice. In August 1941, for months before Pearl Harbor, the Navy approved a test order: 50 landing boats. Higgins had 90 days to deliver them. He delivered them in 73 days. Every boat passed inspection. The Navy ordered 500 more, then 1,000, then 5,000. By the time the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, Higgins Industries had contracts for 8,000 landing boats. The problem was no longer whether the boats could be built. The problem was where to build them. New Orleans in 1941 had no big shipyards. The city had docks, warehouses, and repair shops. It had fishing boats and cargo ships. It didn't have assembly lines. It didn't have trained welders. It didn't have big cranes or steel rolling mills or the electricity to power them. Higgins looked at a map of the city and found 7 locations near the Industrial Canal: swampland, empty lots, fishing docks, places nobody wanted. He rented them all. By January 1942, construction crews were draining swamps and pouring concrete foundations. By March, the first assembly buildings were going up. By May, the factories were working. Higgins Industries now took up 110 acres along the Industrial Canal, 8 separate plants. Each plant specialized in a different part of production. Plant 1 made steel hulls. Plant 2 installed engines. Plant 3 built ramps and hydraulic systems. Plant 4 handled electrical wiring. Plant 5 applied waterproofing and paint. Plant 6 tested finished boats in a man-made pool. Plant 7 and 8 handled repairs and changes. The process wasn't traditional shipbuilding. Higgins borrowed techniques from the car industry, assembly line production, standardized parts, modular construction. Each landing boat broke down into 12 major sections. Each section moved down a separate line. The sections came together at final assembly. Welders joined them into a complete hull. The hull moved to the next station. Engines arrived from Wisconsin. Ramps arrived from Pennsylvania. Radios arrived from New Jersey. By the time a boat reached the end of the line, 387 workers had touched it. None of them saw the entire boat until it was finished. The workforce grew faster than the factories. Higgins hired anyone willing to learn. Former fishermen became welders. Typists became crane operators. High school teachers became electrical engineers. The company trained them in 2-week programs. No previous experience required. Just show up on time and follow instructions. By the end of 1942, Higgins Industries had 14,000 workers. A year later, the number reached 20,000. 40% of them were women. 15% were black workers hired at a time when most defense contractors refused to employ them. The factories ran 24 hours a day, 3 shifts, 8 hours each. The day shift started at 6 o'clock in the morning. The evening shift started at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The night shift started at 10 at night. Shift changes looked like a small city changing populations. Thousands of workers leaving, thousands arriving. The gates never closed. The assembly lines never stopped. Sparks fell from welding torches in 3 separate plants at the same time. Inside Plant 1, the steel hull assembly line stretched 300 feet under a metal roof that trapped heat like an oven. Summer temperatures inside reached 115 degrees. Winter brought no relief, only different problems. Water dripped from the ceiling onto hot metal, creating clouds of steam that made it hard to see. Workers learned to find their way by sound and memory. A flatbed railroad car delivered steel plates cut to exact sizes at a mill in Pennsylvania. The plates arrived wrapped in oil-soaked paper to prevent rust during transport. Workers unwrapped them with gloved hands. The steel measured 3/8 of an inch thick of the hull, a 1/4 inch of the ramp, 5/8 inch of the front that would take the most beating when hitting the beach. Each plate weighed between 100 and 300 pounds, depending on its position in the boat. Overhead cranes lifted the plates onto assembly jigs designed specifically for landing boat production. The jigs held the steel at exact angles, while welders attached them in position. The welding teams worked in pairs. One worker handled the arc welder. The second positioned the next plate. They switched every 20 minutes to prevent arm tiredness. A tired welder made mistakes. Mistakes meant leaks. Leaks meant drownings. The welding process created its own environment. The arc flash burned bright enough to blind. Sparks fell like rain. Ozone from the electrical arc mixed with metal vapor and created a smell that stuck in clothing and hair. Workers wore leather aprons, thick gloves, and dark-tinted masks. Even with protection, burns were common, small ones mostly. The occasional spark that found skin between glove and sleeve. The flash burn that caught an uncovered neck. Medical stations were positioned every 50 feet along the assembly line. A team of riveters followed behind the welders, strengthening important joints. Air-powered hammers drove steel rivets through pre-drilled holes. The noise was extraordinary. A single hammer made 110 decibels. 20 hammers working at the same time created a sound pressure that shook through bone. Workers wore cotton stuff in their ears. Some lost their hearing anyway. By 1943, partial deafness became so common among riveters that the company installed visual signal systems alongside the sound ones. The hammers pounded in rhythm. 3 strikes per rivet. Thousands of rivets per boat. The sound became its own language. Experienced workers could tell by listening whether a rivet was set correctly. A dull thud meant good contact. A metallic ring meant the rivet hadn't seated fully. Poorly set rivets got drilled out and replaced. No exceptions. The military inspectors checked random samples. If they found bad rivets, they rejected the entire boat. A completed hull frame came off the line every 37 minutes. Cranes lifted it onto a wheel cart. The cart rolled along steel tracks toward Plant 2. The track system connected all 8 plants, creating a continuous flow of parts and completed sections. The tracks measured 7 miles total, winding through the factory complex like an industrial railroad. In Plant 2, engine installation teams worked in pairs under conditions that made Plant 1 look comfortable. The engine compartment measured 4 feet by 6 feet. 2 men had to work inside that space at the same time. One mechanic positioned the engine. The second bolted it to the motor mounts. The engine weighed 480 pounds. Moving it required a small overhead hoist and exact coordination. Drop it wrong, and you crushed your partner's foot. Position it wrong, and the drive shaft wouldn't line up. The engines arrived from Gray Marine Motor Company in Detroit. They were modified versions of the Chrysler flathead 6-cylinder engine used in regular trucks. The modification involved waterproofing the electrical system and adding a heavy-duty cooling system capable of working in salt water. Each engine made 125 horsepower at 2,800 revolutions per minute. Not powerful by ship standards, but reliable. Reliability mattered more than speed. Fuel lines connected from the tank to the carburetor, using reinforced rubber hoses clamped at both ends. Cooling systems attached to a heat exchanger that used seawater as coolant. The seawater intake valve had to be positioned exactly 3 inches below the waterline. Too high and it sucked air during rough seas. Too low and it dragged bottom in shallow water. The margin for error measured less than an inch. Throttle cables went through the steering console, using a pipe system that protected them from water and damage. The cables measured exactly 17 feet 3 inches from throttle grip to carburetor. Any shorter and they pulled tight during hard turns. Any longer and they developed slack that made exact speed control impossible. The measurements had been figured out through testing. Now they were standard. Every boat built exactly the same way. Electrical wiring ran from the battery to the ignition to the running lights to the radio system to the bilge pump. 247 feet of wire per boat, each wire color-coded, each connection soldered and wrapped in waterproof tape. The electrical systems had to work after complete submersion. The military tested this by sinking boats in training pools, then dragging them out and trying to start them. If the engine didn't fire on the first try, the boat failed inspection. The entire installation process took 1 hour and 42 minutes per boat under normal conditions. Any longer, and the line backed up. Plant 3 couldn't start its work until Plant 2 finished. Plant 4 couldn't begin until Plant 3 completed its section. The timing cascaded through the entire factory. One delay in engine installation meant delays in ramp assembly, hydraulic testing, electrical installation, and final painting. A 30-minute slowdown in Plant 2 created a 3-hour backup by the end of the day. The pressure to keep pace was constant. Supervisors walked the line with stopwatches. They didn't yell. They didn't need to. Everyone understood the math. Slower work meant fewer boats. Fewer boats meant men died waiting for transportation that never arrived. The workers pushed themselves harder than any supervisor could have demanded. Mistakes were inevitable. A weld cracked under stress. A bolt loosened during engine tests. A hydraulic line leaked under pressure. Inspectors caught most errors before the boats left the factory. Some they didn't. Some boats broke down during training exercises. Some failed during actual landings. The military tracked failure rates, filed reports, demanded corrections. Higgins responded by adding inspection stations. By early 1943, every landing boat went through 14 separate quality checks before delivery. Quality control became its own department. Inspectors carried clipboards and measuring tools. They checked weld strength, measured ramp angles, tested hydraulic pressure, verified engine compression. If a boat failed any test, it returned to the right station. The crew responsible for the error fixed it. No exceptions, no appeals. A landing boat either met requirements or it didn't. Men would die if the boats failed. The inspectors never forgot that. Production numbers climbed throughout 1943. In January, the factories completed 670 landing boats. In March, the number reached 800. By June, it hit 1,000. The Navy increased orders. The Army requested a modified version with thicker armor. The Marines wanted boats capable of carrying tanks. Higgins redesigned the boats without stopping production. The assembly lines adapted in real time. New parts arrived. New procedures were printed. Workers learned modifications on the job. The military gave different models different names for different purposes. The LCVP, Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, carried 36 soldiers or one jeep. The LCM, Landing Craft Mechanized, carried one 30-ton Sherman tank. The LCI, Landing Craft Infantry, carried 200 troops. The LCT, Landing Craft Tank, carried 4 Sherman tanks. Higgins Industries built all of them. By the end of 1943, the factories had made 12,000 boats. The company became the largest private employer in Louisiana. The workers didn't know where the boats were going. They knew the war existed. They knew men were dying. They didn't know about D-Day. Nobody did. The invasion plan stayed secret. Until 3 days before the landings. But inside the factories, workers understood what was at stake. Every weld mattered. Every bolt mattered. If a ramp jammed, men died in the water. If an engine failed, soldiers drowned before reaching the beach. The work wasn't abstract. It was life or death made real in steel and rivets. Women made up nearly half the workforce. Most had never worked outside their homes before the war. Now they ran drill presses, arc welders, and hydraulic lifts. They wore coveralls and steel-toed boots. They worked 10-hour shifts in 100-degree heat. Welding masks hid their faces. Sparks burned through their sleeves. Some worked alongside their husbands. Some worked while their husbands fought overseas. None of them complained. The work was hard. The pay was decent. The purpose was clear. Black workers faced different challenges. Many had been kept out of industrial jobs before the war. Unions resisted their hiring. White workers threatened strikes. Higgins ignored the threats. He needed workers. He didn't care about skin color. He cared about production. By 1943, 3,000 black workers were employed across the plants. They worked the same shifts, earned the same wages, and used the same cafeterias as white workers. In a segregated South, Higgins Industries became one of the most integrated factories in the country. The integration wasn't perfect. Tensions existed. Arguments erupted. Some workers quit rather than share workspace. Higgins responded by threatening to fire anyone who disrupted production. The policy was simple: work together or leave. Most workers stayed. They had families to feed, bills to pay. The war didn't pause for personal prejudices. Neither did the assembly lines. If this kind of untold history matters to you, we'd appreciate your support. Subscribe to stay updated on the engineering marvels and human stories that shape the world. Every subscription helps us keep researching and producing these documentaries. By early 1944, the factories had hit their highest production rate, 1,200 landing boats per month, 40 boats per day, 1 boat every 36 minutes. The industrial canal filled with newly completed boats. They floated in rows side by side, waiting for transport. Navy crews arrived weekly to collect them. Tugboats pulled them in groups of 20 to the Mississippi River. From there, they traveled to staging areas on the Gulf Coast, then across the Atlantic, toward Europe, toward beaches that nobody in New Orleans had ever seen. On June 5, 1944, workers inside the Higgins factories finished their shifts and went home. They didn't know the invasion would begin the next morning. They didn't know that 12,000 landing boats were already positioned off the coast of Normandy. They didn't know that 156,000 Allied soldiers would depend on those boats to reach the beaches. The workers went home, slept, and returned to their shifts the next day. The assembly lines kept running. The war needed more boats. More boats needed more workers. The cycle continued. At 6:30 in the morning on June 6, the first wave launched from transport ships 12 miles off the French coast. The landing boats formed into lines, 31 boats per line, 8 lines total, 248 boats in the first attack wave. Behind them, 3 more waves waited their turn. Behind those, hundreds more sat ready to follow. Engines rumbled at idle, creating a mechanical growl that rolled across the water. Waves broke over the fronts, sending spray across the soldiers packed below deck. The channel ran rough that morning, 3 to 4 foot swells. Wind from the northeast at 15 knots. Visibility 4 miles through scattered rain and mist. Not terrible conditions, not good ones either. Inside the boats, soldiers sat shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches bolted to the hull. 36 men per boat, full combat gear, rifles, ammunition, grenades, gas masks, food packs. Some carried Bangalore torpedoes for clearing wire obstacles. Some carried radios weighing 30 pounds. Some carried medical supplies. Total weight per soldier averaged 80 pounds. Total weight per boat exceeded 3 tons before adding fuel and crew. Most soldiers had never been in combat. Most were 18 to 22 years old. Most were from small towns across America. They trained for months, practiced beach landings on English coasts, studied maps of the French coastline, memorized unit goals. But training never prepared anyone for the reality of sailing toward enemy guns, knowing you can't turn back. The boats pushed through swells toward the coastline. Each swell lifted the front, then dropped it into the trough. The steel hulls slammed against the water hard enough to ring like bells. Inside, men held themselves against the impacts. Some gripped the bench edges. Some held their rifles. Some closed their eyes and prayed silently. Conversations were impossible over the engine noise and the constant pounding of waves against the hull. Seasickness affected nearly everyone. The combination of diesel fumes, wave motion, fear, and adrenaline created nausea that overpowered even the strongest stomachs. Soldiers vomited into their helmets, into their packs, over their boots. The smell mixed with diesel and salt spray and fear. Some soldiers had been on transport ships for 16 hours before boarding the landing boats. They'd been sick before the boats even launched. Now 12 miles from shore, they were beyond sick. They were exhausted, dehydrated, and terrified. German defenders watched from fortified positions on the cliffs. They'd been watching since before dawn. Radar had detected the invasion fleet hours earlier. Artillery crews stood ready at their guns. Machine gun positions were manned and loaded. The beach stretched flat and empty between the waterline and the seawall, 400 yards of open sand with zero cover. The defensive plan was simple. Let the boats reach the beach, wait for the ramps to drop, then open fire. Maximum casualties in minimum time. The landing zone, called Omaha Beach, stretched 6 miles along the Norman coast. The beach divided into 5 sectors, each with its own code name. Charlie, Dog Green, Dog White, Dog Red, Easy Green, Easy Red, and Fox Green. The first wave would hit all sectors at the same time at H hour. 6:30 a.m. follow-up waves would land every 10 minutes for the first 3 hours. At 6:35 a.m., 500 yards from shore, the coxswains pushed their throttles forward. The engines roared from idle to full power, 2,800 revolutions per minute. The boats accelerated from 8 knots to 11 knots. Maximum speed for the conditions. The fronts lifted slightly as the hulls planed across the swells. Spray shot 20 feet into the air on both sides of each boat. At 400 yards, German artillery opened fire. The first shells fell short, exploding in the water 50 yards ahead of the leading boats. Columns of white water erupted skyward. The next round came closer. One shell hit a boat in the second wave. Direct hit. The boat exploded. Debris flew outward. Men flew outward. The boat sank in less than 20 seconds. 36 soldiers and 3 crew members gone before reaching the beach. At 300 yards, machine guns joined the artillery. MG-42S firing from concrete bunkers at 1,200 rounds per minute. The sound was distinctive, a mechanical buzz that carried across the water like chainsaws. Tracers arced through the rain and mist in bright horizontal lines. Most rounds passed overhead. Some struck hulls with metallic cracks. The steel held. The boats kept coming. At 200 yards, the German fire got worse. More machine guns, more artillery, mortars now. The beach erupted in explosions and muzzle flashes. The noise became overwhelming. Artillery booming, machine guns chattering, shells screaming, water exploding. The soldiers inside the boats heard it all and saw nothing. They sat in the dark belly of steel hulls, sailing toward sounds that promised death. At 100 yards, the coxswains began looking for landing points. The beach ahead showed obstacles the aerial reconnaissance had missed. Wooden stakes driven into the sand, steel rails welded into hedgehogs, concrete barriers, some topped with mines. The obstacles ran in rows parallel to the shore, spaced to catch boats at different tide levels. The coxswains had to weave between them or risk hitting mines that would blow the front off. At 50 yards, individual German soldiers became visible in their positions. Men behind machine guns, men loading mortars, men preparing grenades. Some defenders were teenagers. Some were veterans of the Russian front. All of them fired at the approaching boats with everything they had. At 6:47 a.m., the first landing boats hit Omaha Beach. The time was recorded in multiple after-action reports filed by surviving officers. The exact minute mattered because every following wave timed their landing by reference to that first touchdown. H plus 17 minutes. H plus 27 minutes. Military operations ran on exact timing, even when everything else descended into chaos. The boat called LCI for 75 hit bottom first, striking sand in sector dog green directly in front of the Vierville exit from the beach. The coxswain cut the engine. The front scraped forward another 10 feet before stopping. The boat sat in 3 feet of water 60 yards from dry sand. The hydraulic system engaged. The ram began to drop. Steel scraped against steel. The ramp went down through its arc. As the ramp lowered, it exposed the men inside to direct fire. Machine gun rounds punched through the opening before the ramp touched water. Soldiers in the front rank were hit while still standing inside the boat. They fell forward. The men behind them had nowhere to go except forward over the bodies. The ramp hit water. 36 soldiers ran forward into machine gun fire that couldn't miss. The distance from ramp to German positions measured 280 yards. Maximum effective range for an MG-42 was 800 yards. The machine gunners didn't need to aim carefully. They just fired in sweeping arcs across the ramp area. Bullets hit water, hit men, hit equipment, hit everything. Men fell in the water. The weight of their equipment pulled them under. 80 pounds of gear. Boots filled with water. Uniforms soaked. Arms couldn't fight the weight. Some soldiers drowned in 3 feet of water without ever seeing the beach. Some made it to the sand and were hit running toward the seawall. Some made it to the seawall and found temporary cover. Most didn't make it at all. The boat backed away from the beach. The ramp pulled back up. The coxswain reversed the engine and backed into deeper water. The entire process from ramp drop to departure took 43 seconds. In that time, 22 soldiers were killed and 11 were wounded. 3 reached the seawall alive. The boat turned and headed back toward the transport ships to collect the next load. 248 landing boats hit the beach in the first wave. The experience of LCI for 75 repeated across all 5 sectors with minor variations. Some boats hit mines and exploded. Some beached successfully but took casualties on the run to the seawall. Some landed in the wrong sector and found weaker defenses. Some landed directly under the heaviest guns and lost everyone. The casualty rate in the first wave exceeded 60% in some units. By 7:15 a.m., 2,000 Americans were dead or wounded on Omaha Beach. But the boats kept coming. Every 10 minutes, another wave, another 200 boats. The Germans couldn't stop them all. They couldn't cover every sector at the same time. They couldn't reload fast enough. They couldn't see through the smoke from their own guns. The sheer number of targets overwhelmed the defenses. Some boats made it through. Some soldiers reached the seawall. Some units pushed forward toward the bluffs. The defenses that had seemed impossible to break began to crack. By 9 a.m., 16,000 soldiers had landed at Omaha Beach. Half were combat effective. Half were casualties or pinned down by fire. But 16,000 was enough. Enough to establish a foothold. Enough to push inland. Enough to force the Germans to commit reserves. Enough to prove that the landing could succeed despite the casualties. The landings continued throughout the day. Boat after boat, wave after wave. By evening, 34,000 soldiers had crossed the beach. Tanks rolled off LCTs directly onto the sand. Artillery pieces arrived on LCMs and were set up in firing positions. Supply trucks drove off LCVPs and began moving ammunition to forward units. The invasion that military planners had feared would fail was succeeding. Slowly, bloodily, but succeeding. The Higgins boats made it possible. They kept coming despite the fire, despite the casualties, despite the mines and obstacles and machine guns. The coxswains drove them straight toward the guns because that was the job. The ramps dropped because the hydraulics worked. The engines ran because the mechanics in Louisiana had installed them correctly. The hulls held because the welders in Plant 1 had done their work with precision. Every technical decision made in the factories 3,000 miles away affected whether men lived or died on Omaha Beach. The landings continued for 3 days. Each day brought more boats, more men, more equipment. By June 9th, 156,000 Allied troops had crossed the Channel and landed in France. Tanks rolled off LCTs directly onto the sand. Artillery pieces arrived on LCMs. Supply trucks drove off LCVPs and up the beach roads. The invasion that military planners said couldn't happen was happening. The boats made it possible. Not all the boats survived. German artillery sank dozens. Mines destroyed more. Rough seas swamped some before they reached the beach. The failure rate ran around 8%. That meant 92% succeeded. In military terms, that was exceptional. In human terms, it meant thousands of soldiers reached the shore alive who would have drowned using any other method. The Higgins boats didn't win the war by themselves, but they gave the invasion a chance to succeed. Without them, D-Day would have failed. Inside the Higgins factories, workers learned about the invasion from newspapers and radio broadcasts. They heard casualty reports. They heard about the beach landings. They understood for the first time what the boats were for. Some workers cried. Some felt pride. Some felt horror at the deaths. Most just returned to their shifts. The war wasn't over. More landings were coming. The Pacific Theater needed thousands of additional boats. The Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, every island invasion needed boats. The factories kept making them. By the end of 1944, Higgins Industries had built 20,000 landing boats. The company also made torpedo boats, patrol vessels, and even experimental amphibious vehicles. The workforce exceeded 23,000 people. The factories consumed 15 tons of steel per day. The electrical bills exceeded $50,000 per month. The industrial canal, once a quiet backwater, became one of the most productive shipyards in the world. All of it built on reclaimed swampland by workers who'd never built a warship before the war started. Production slowed in 1945 as the war neared its end. Contracts were reduced. Workers were laid off. By September, when Japan surrendered, the factories were operating at 20% capacity. The military no longer needed landing boats. Victory eliminated demand. Within 6 months, most of the plants closed. The workers found other jobs. The assembly lines fell silent. Steel rusted. Paint peeled. The boats that once filled the canal disappeared into storage or scrapyards. Andrew Jackson Higgins didn't live to see the wars and reshape his empire. He died in 1952, 7 years after the factories closed. The company went bankrupt. The plants were sold for parts. The land went back to industrial use. Most of the buildings were torn down by 1960. Today, almost nothing remains of the factories that built the boats that won the war. A historical marker stands near the site. A small museum keeps a few artifacts. But the swamp reclaimed most of the land. The canal flows quietly past rusted pilings and empty lots where 20,000 workers once built history, one weld at a time. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, later said that Andrew Jackson Higgins was the man who won the war for us. Eisenhower didn't say that about generals or admirals. He said about a boat builder from New Orleans, a man who looked at a swamp and saw a shipyard, a man who hired workers nobody else would hire, a man who believed production speed mattered more than tradition. The 20,000 workers never received medals. They didn't march in victory parades. Most never saw the ocean. They built boats in a swamp and sent them to war. They worked 8-hour shifts in 100-degree heat. They welded steel until their hands blistered. They ran machinery until their backs ached. They knew men were dying. They knew their work mattered. That knowledge kept them returned to the factories every day for 4 years. Before we close, if these stories resonate with you, if you believe this kind of history deserves to be remembered, please subscribe. We're committed to bringing you the true stories behind the machines and the people who built them. Your support makes this work possible. On Omaha Beach today, tourists walk the sand where soldiers died. Memorials mark the landing zones. Flags wave above the cliffs. The beach is peaceful now. The war ended 80 years ago. But beneath the calm surface, history remembers the steel ramps that dropped, the engines that roared, the boats that carried men into machine gun fire. Those boats came from Louisiana. They came from workers who never saw combat. They came from factories built in 90 days on land that used a flood every spring. They came from a belief that impossible things become possible when ordinary people refuse to accept failure. 23,000 landing boats built by 20,000 workers. Most of them are gone now. The workers died decades ago. The factories vanished. The boats sank or rusted or were cut apart for scrap. But their contribution remains. Every history of D-Day mentions the landing boats. Every account of the invasion acknowledges their importance. Yet few people know where they came from. Few people know about the swamps of New Orleans. Few people know about the men and women who built them. This is their story. Not the story of generals or battles. Not the story of strategy or tactics. The story of production. The story of workers. The story of what happens when ordinary people are given extraordinary responsibility and refuse to fail. The story of how wars are won not just on battlefields, but in factories, on assembly lines, in the hands of welders and riveters and crane operators who never fired a shot. The boats are gone. The workers are gone. The factories are gone. But the memory remains, steel and sweat, and 20,000 people who built the vessels that carried 156,000 soldiers to the beaches of Normandy. That memory doesn't fade. It echoes forward through time, a reminder that history isn't made only by those who fight. It's made by those who build, by those who work, by those who weld, by those who refuse to let impossibility define the limits of what can be done. That's the legacy of the Higgins factories, not just the boats, not just the invasion. The idea that ordinary people, given a purpose and a deadline, can change the course of history. The idea that a swamp in Louisiana can become the birthplace of victory. The idea that war is won not only with courage, but with production, precision, and the relentless determination of workers who understand that every weld, every bolt, every completed boat brings the end of war one step closer. The sun rises over the industrial canal today. The water flows quietly past abandoned docks. Weeds grow where the assembly lines once stood. No markers identify the exact locations of Plant 1 or Plant 2. No monuments honor the welders. No statues remember the crane operators. But the work they did remains embedded in history. It remains carved into the story of how the war was won. It remains in the archives, the photographs, the after-action reports that describe the landings in exact technical detail. 23,000 landing boats built by 20,000 workers in 4 years on reclaimed swampland for a war most of them never saw. That's not just a production statistic. That's proof of what happens when purpose meets ability, when necessity meets determination, when a nation asks its workers to do the impossible and they respond by building history one boat at a time. The boats carried soldiers to the beaches. The workers carried the weight of knowing that men's lives depended on their precision. Both succeeded. Both are remembered, one in memorials and ceremonies, the other in stories like this. Stories that insist on remembering not just the battles, but the infrastructure that made them possible, Stories that refuse to let time erase the contribution of those who built the machines that changed the world. This is the story of the Higgins factories. This is a story of 20,000 workers who won D-Day before the first soldier stepped onto the beach. This is a story of how wars are truly won,